All right. Good afternoon. All right. So it is still week 2, and this is the second video. I broke these. Normally, I'd just post one video per week, but I decided to break these videos into 2. Right. So hopefully you've already watched the one video on structure and relevance theory to criminology, and this is the one on social disorganization. All right. So just like last time, I think you'll probably find it helpful if you have already read the chapter before you listen to me talk about it. And you'll probably find it helpful if you've already looked over the PowerPoints, and probably would be helpful if you have the PowerPoints open, right? And perhaps even your book open, right? And I will probably refer to certain things in, by the PowerPoint slide they're on and something for occasionally, right? So as I make these to kind of remind me of what the most important things are in the chapter that I need to hit upon, I'll have these PowerPoint slides open, and I'll kind of be briefly going over them, although I will not read every bullet point, right? Because there's a lot of stuff in here. Like I originally wrote these PowerPoints and developed this class back when video was very difficult to do on Canvas, right? And, like 20 years ago, where video over a few minutes would just bog down the internet and stuff. So the PowerPoints are kind of, they're designed to stand alone without someone lecturing over them, right? And that's one of the reasons why I won't go over every minute detail in them, right? So, if you look in that file in the PowerPoints, you'll see that, oh boy, what is it? The first 7 slides are all about, 6 slides are all about structure and relevance. So if you go down here to slide 8, you see we finally get started talking about social disorganization. And I titled all this Social Disorganization / Collective Efficacy, right? And I want to talk a little bit about this, right? Usually each week we will cover kind of the original old school theory that came about, social disorganization. Most of these ideas came about 1920s and 30s, certainly before World War II, right? But I also like to include some of the more recent ideas in this same theoretical tradition, right? So there are still people that are using this theory, although it's kind of changed some. Certainly the language has been updated. There's small little tweaks, so you might think of it as like the new and improved version of social disorganization, and collective efficacy is one of those new and improved versions of social disorganization, right? And so I like to do this every time I talk about theory. So most weeks we will cover, a theory as it existed in its origins, whether that's 100 years ago, 50, 30 years ago, and then we'll look and see how it's changed and how it's kind of developed into something slightly different, but still really similar to the original, right? So you get the kind of old school and the new and improved version, right? Or at least the new version. Sometimes it's maybe not improved, right? So kind of expect that each week, right? All right. Social disorganization theory originally was not a criminological theory, right? It was really a theory of how cities develop. So it was a theory of urbanization, right? And this was during a period in the United States, and this is an American theory. And before this, most theories were European, right? And this is kind of the moment where sociology kind of become centered in the United States. And that happened really at the University of Chicago, right? So all these professors that were social disorganization theory, they were living in Chicago. And most of them came from like small Midwestern towns, countryside. And now they find themselves in one of the biggest cities in the United States. And one of the things about Chicago is, 100 years ago, it wasn't really a city, right? I mean, 100 years ago, before these people were writing about it, right? And that's true of a lot of American cities, right? I mean, there are some like Boston and New York and stuff like that are fairly old, but Birmingham, for example, it's not much of a city at all until 1880s, 1890s, right? It's one of the reasons why they call it the Magic City, because it just seemed like in no time it went from Jones Valley to a big city, right? And that magic, it disappeared, and that happened to a lot of cities during that time, right? That's this time during rapid industrialization in the United States. It happens later in the United States than it does in Europe, right? And people were trying to understand it, right? And so it was originally a theory of how cities develop. And they tend to develop in, if you look at slide 10, they tend to develop in concentric zones, right? So the center of the city, right, is typically where the factories are. Like urbanization and industrialization just go hand in hand, right? They're two, the reason why the people move to the city is because the factories are there, right? The factories are there because society's industrialized. Why they move from the farms? Because it's moving to an industrial society and away from an agricultural society, right? And they move because they're factory jobs, and they're better jobs working on farming, or at least they hope that they are, right? And in this time in the United States, like, early 1900s to 1920s, we have waves of immigrants. When people tell you that we are a country of immigrants, they are true. They're telling you the truth, right? Everyone here, their ancestors are immigrants, except for Native Americans, right? And there are different theories about where they came from, but they most likely came from other places as well, right? And that really affected the makeup of cities, right? Because what would happen during those times is mostly European ethnicities would come into places like Easter Island and New York City, and then they would talk to relatives that had already been here, or they write letters and stuff like that, and they would find out that, or they'd hear through rumors or see ads in newspapers and stuff, there were jobs in Chicago. And maybe they already had some people in their family or from their village they moved from in Europe, and they could go there and they'd let them sleep on the floor or something like that, and help them get up on their feet and stuff like that, right? And these immigrants came in waves, so they tended to be like a high number of people from Italy. Then a few years passed, and like not too many from Italy. They're all coming from Poland, or all coming from Germany or something like that. So they came in waves, like successions of people, right? And that's a pretty important part of all of this, right? And they wouldn't live in the absolute center of the city, because that's where the factories are. But this zone, right around the center of the city, that's where they would typically move to when they first got into the city, right? And this was not really a pleasant place to live. cities were not pleasant places to live in general, right? And the neighborhoods immediately next to the warehouses and the factories, that tended to be the cheapest housing, right? In fact, it was a lot of like you could rent an apartment and you would probably share it with a large number of people, and you would probably pay per week rather than per month, right? There also tended to be a lot of boarding houses. Very few people owned the houses that they lived in. They were owned by landlords. And you would probably say like slumlords if you're familiar with that term, right? And it would be the neighborhoods with high population density, large number of people in a given square mile, right? And the factories that most people were coming to in Chicago, they were, and this is kind of weird, meat processing plants. So there was a moment where meat processing became industrialized. Before that, it was like you had a butcher that lives in your neighborhood, and he would take one cow or one pig or whatever, and he would cut it up and package it and sell it to people. But that trade becomes de-skilled, and it happens on an assembly line in a factory and stuff like that. So, and those jobs were very attractive to people who didn't have a whole lot of skills, perhaps didn't even speak the language, right? And they could be told, I've never worked on a meat processing plant. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I can imagine what it's like. And, at the beginning of it, there's, someone that leads the livestock in, and there's someone that kills it, right? And then there's someone that skins it. And then there's someone that, I don't know, chops or saws parts of it off. And some of those parts they make steaks out of, some they make sausage out of, and stuff like that, right? And then there's another person that gets rid of the bones, and they do something with the bones, and I'll make fertilizer out of it or something like that, right? And when different people do those things, those different tasks, and they're simple tasks that you repeat over and over and over again, right? Then it's very easy to train that person that morning that they're hired and say, here's what you do. And you do it 1,000 times a day. And you come back tomorrow, you do 1,000 more times. It's not like the butcher where you have to do every step, right? That de-skills it. That means they can pay them a lot less. They can train them in a very short amount of time, and that makes the product much cheaper, right? Think of Henry Ford's assembly line or something like that, right? And so imagine living next to a meat processing plant in 1920. Not a pleasant place to live. I mean, I would imagine it was incredibly stinky, right? I mean, rotting, this is, it's not a pleasant place. So, like, if you could afford to live further away, you would move away. But if you could not afford, right, and you had to, it's before a lot of public transportation, certainly before widespread ownership of cars and interstates and stuff like that. So the poor people that worked in the factories, they'd have to live right next to it so they could easily get to work, right? So there are waves of people coming, right? And, if you play your cards right, if you work, save up your money, perhaps learn the language, what they would say, assimilate. Perhaps you, and if not you, perhaps your kids could save up a little bit of money to move to a slightly better neighborhood, right? And that's in one of the, if you're looking at slide number 10, you go from one of those small circles and then you get a little bit further out, right? And if you can kind of eventually get out into the suburbs, well, you live in a nice place, and you own your own house, and your neighbors own their own houses, and everyone tends to buy a house and stay there for a long period of time, right? And there's not much crime there, right? And so this was kind of the theory of like how cities develop, and as people become successful, what they tend to do. And to achieve the American dream in a lot of ways is you move out to the suburbs, and you own your own house and picket fence, and all your neighbors look just like you, right? And that's exactly the opposite of those inner city neighborhoods, because inner city neighborhoods, high population turnover, lots of people moving in and moving out constantly, right? That's the first thing that leads to social disorganization, in and out migration, right? The second thing, you could list these in any number, in any type of order, doesn't really matter, right? The second thing is what they call ethnic heterogeneity. That just means I walk outside my neighborhood and I see Italians, and I see, people who are Polish. I see, I don't know, people who are German, all these different ethnicities, right? And back then they would be speaking different languages, right? And that's ethnic heterogeneity. And those neighborhoods, I mean, cities are still like this, right? Bigger cities than Birmingham. But if you go to downtown New York, you'll overhear people speaking all sorts of different languages, right? And it's not just tourists either, right? And you would also have in these neighborhoods what you call ethnic enclaves, like neighborhoods like, you've probably heard of like Little China, but there'd be Little Italy, Little Russia, right? And it's neighborhoods where immigrants have moved to. They set up businesses. They still speak their language. If you've ever been to a big city like San Francisco, has a really big Chinatown. And if you go to McDonald's in Chinatown, the menu is in Chinese, right? And that's kind of interesting, right? And most people on the street will be speaking Chinese, right? And so this is how Chicago was. In fact, Birmingham was like that. There was a Little Italy, a Little Russia in Birmingham and stuff like that. Those neighborhoods still exist. They don't have those. Not the same people live there anymore, but they do sometimes. I think there's a neighborhood somewhere in Bessemer that's called Little Italy's. Yeah, I think it's probably 90% black now, but at one time it was almost all Italian immigrants, right? So that's ethnic heterogeneity, right? The third thing is poverty, right? And that's where the poorest rent is. That's where the most unpleasant living conditions are. That's where the poor people live, right? And those three things, right, lead to social disorganization. It leads to people not knowing each other. When they do know each other, they don't trust each other. It is difficult for them to communicate. It's difficult to them achieve certain, like what now we would call like social goods or public goods. It's difficult for them to socialize the youth. It's difficult for them to control crime. It's difficult for them to let's get together and let's have a really effective school system. Right? So their schools tend to be of relatively low quality compared to suburbs, right? And it's not because of the attributes of those individuals, right? It's not because, those people are good or bad, or, it's certainly not because of their ethnicity or their race. It's because social disorganization. And the reason, and how we figured this out as sociologists is like, there were a lot of people, like when those neighborhoods near the factories were 90% Italians, there were a lot of people that would say, oh, those are the dangerous parts of the city because that's how Italians are, they just commit more crime, these kind of racial stereotypes, right? Well, because people would come in waves, right? And they would leave in waves too, right? 10 years later, instead of it being mostly Italians, it would be mostly Irish, right? And all those Italians in the meantime would have moved out into the suburbs. And when they moved out to the suburbs, they stopped committing crime, right? 10 years after that, all of the, Irish, when they moved to a different neighborhood that had a different level of social organization, they stopped committing crime too, right? So that shows you that it's not about their ethnicity, right? That has some really important lessons for us, right? And really what it means is like, it doesn't matter what the ethnicity is. If any group of people, any ethnicity, lives in a neighborhood with high population turnover, high rates of poverty, right, and lots of ethnic heterogeneity, or what we would call diversity today, then they're going to have all the social problems, including crime, right? Now, let me apply this to, there were a lot of people during those times, and like I don't know what you do or you don't know about early 1900s, but a lot of people were what's called xenophobic, right? We would call it racist today, but this is about ethnicity, not race. So it's more accurate to say people had these stereotypes about the Irish, about every ethnicity, right? Like, oh, those people are just like that. And so if someone said, like, oh, why do they have so many crimes in those neighborhoods, right? People would say, oh, it's because those types of people, right, are different than the rest of us. And, oh, they just, But I told you, when they moved out, they stopped behaving that way, right? They stopped committing crime, right? So it couldn't be, if it was just about their ethnicity, when they moved out the suburbs, they would continue committing crimes at the same rate, right? But they don't, right? Now, I'm going to ask you to do something. And, I don't know if I should do this right. Bear with me, right? All right, so as I imagine you guys read like articles on AL.com, right? And it's very common for them to have an article about crime in Birmingham. And I'm certainly not going to repeat the type of stuff you would hear in the comments section on AL.com. And I really don't recommend that you read it. It's just like horrible, racist stuff. And how do they explain why Birmingham, particularly the western part of Birmingham, has high levels of crime? Well, they won't say population turnover. They won't say poverty, right? They won't say, diversity or ethnic or heterogeneity or anything like that. You'll get a bunch of just flat out racist stuff, right? I mean, talk to people, that's often kind of the dominant the dominant layperson's way of explaining why some neighborhoods have high crime, right? And social disorganization is like that. That might be what most people think, but most people are wrong. That's not why those neighborhoods have high rates of crime. It has nothing to do with the ethnic or racial characteristics of those people. It has to do with the conditions that they live in, right? It has to do with the population turnover, right? It has to do with poverty, right? And if you look at those neighborhoods, people are always, I don't know. I don't know. One of the weird things about living in cities, a lot of people don't go to other parts of the city that are unlike the ones that they live in. But if you're like me, a sociologist, you do, right? And you drive through poorer parts of the town. One of the things I'm often struck by is like it seems like people are moving all the time, right? I mean, you see all their stuff out on the side of the road. They're always throwing away mattresses and furniture and stuff. People are getting evicted constantly. Well, that's people moving in and moving out, right? People in those poorer neighborhoods don't typically own their houses. If you ask the inhabitants of those neighborhoods, how many times have you moved in the last 20 years? It will be a high number, right? Where if you go to the more affluent parts of town, you're like, oh, I've been in this house for 20 years, and before this, I was in a different house for 15 years and stuff like that. And people don't move around as a lot. That's the in and out migration, right? And then, of course, in those neighborhoods where there's high crime, there's high poverty, right? Well-established correlate of crime, right? Poor neighborhoods just tend to, yeah. And that's social disorganization, right? Now, there's some other kind of interesting things that happen, right? Particularly in the history of the United States. And some of this has to do with ethnicity and rape too. Ethnicity and race too, right? And I feel like as a sociologist, I got to tell you a little bit about this because it's an interesting story, right? For most people, well, I'll say for most European ethnicities, they kind of lose. People like me that look like me, we kind of lose our ethnic characteristics and ethnic practices, right? So much that most white Europeans cannot look at another white European and accurately guess what their ethnicity is. So everyone that is watching this video, do you have any idea what my ethnicity is? I doubt you do, unless you heard me talk about this in another class, right? And this is kind of the history of the United States and the history of race, right? My ancestors were Welsh, right? So they came from Wales, right? Now, do I speak like a Welshman? Do I wear traditional Welsh attire? No. I mean, if I was eating a meal, or like, oh, that's Welsh food, right? No. I mean, I don't even know those things, right? I can't even imitate a Welsh accent. I can't recognize it when I see someone else, right? I don't know one single Welsh dish or recipe, right? I don't own any clothing that I think is typical, right? And that's what happens to most. All of those white European ethnicities lose the relevance of their ethnicity kind of fades into the background, and they all become white, right? And they all consider themselves white. And in Europe, it didn't mean really anything to be white, right? That's That's the history of race and ethnicity in the United States over the last 200 years. Is that all the ethnicity, all the white Europeans, they stop acting in ethnic ways, and their identity is no longer tied to their ethnicity, and they just become white. And that often matters a lot to their identity, and yeah. And I don't know. I always kind of thought that was kind of interesting because I mean, my ancestors' skin, I guess, was close to my skin, but they say you've heard this race is social construction, and that's how it's constructed. It didn't mean much of anything, 400 years ago in Europe. So much that when someone saw my answers, they didn't say, "Oh, that's a white guy." No, they thought there's a Welshman. It's kind of hard for us to wrap our head around, right? But that's what happens, right? There's all those white ethnicities. Now, there's some white ethnicities that Italians have retained, some of their ethnic traits and stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I always thought that was kind of neat, right? That's kind of part of social disorganization, right? And I said that at the beginning of this theory, it really wasn't designed to explain crime. In fact, it was used to explain all sorts of other stuff, right? So if you look at these concentric circles, right, and you see two of them on slide number 10. One is how it works in the typical city, the one on the left where it says model. Chicago is on a lake, so it gets kind of cut in half. So it's like concentric arcs rather than circles, right? And so they developed this model based upon Chicago, and then they went and they looked at all these other cities in the United States at that same time. They're like, damn, it works kind of the same way in all these other cities. In fact, they went to Birmingham, they went to Atlanta, right? And for the most part, it worked pretty much the same. Now, some had a river that ran through them, some had mountains that ran through them, some had railroad tracks that ran through them, kind of like Chicago was on a lake, but for the most part, it was pretty much the same, right? The physical barriers in some cities differed, right? So they would look at this like not the very center, but like what they call the zone. All right, so if you look at this, there's the loop, the very center, and then there's a factory, which would be factories and warehouse, and then they would see the zone of transition, which is this yellow one. It's not in the very middle, not in the next one, but in the third one. That's where you would see all sorts of social problems, right? And so some of the things that they discovered were more likely in that zone of transit is like illiteracy rates, sexually transmitted diseases, failing schools, right? This is like all sorts of social problems, right? Things that are not good, right? Were more common in those, like what we call bad neighborhoods, right? And eventually someone was like, well, let's look at juvenile delinquency. And lo and behold, it was more common in those neighborhoods too. All those neighborhoods that had high poverty, ethnic heterogeneity, and population turnover. Did I say that right? Poverty, ethnic heterogeneity, population turnover. I realize I'm not saying them in the exact same order, right? It really doesn't matter what order you say them, but that's kind of the important thing, right? And tell you a little bit about like how they map these things, because I always kind of thought this was interesting too, right? This is way before computers, this is way before like GIS and satellite images and stuff like that, right? So what they would have is a map in the building at the University of Chicago, and it would be a big map that would cover the whole wall. And as they map different, like when they arrested a juvenile delinquent, they would get out a pen, like a push pen, like a pen that has a little head on it, and you stick it into something, and they would find that person's address on that map, and they would stick it in there. They move to the next file, find out where that juvenile delinquent is, and they put another one in there. And they would do that over and over and over again as they went through all these files of juvenile delinquency. And then when you took a few steps back and looked at that map, a pattern would emerge. So there would be lots of them in those bad neighborhoods toward the center of the city, but when you got out to the suburbs further and further away, there would be very few of them, right? And you might have encountered this before. There's a kind of a practice that you see occasionally at truck stops, and I've also seen it at restaurants where the customers that come to the restaurant or truck stop, they will give them a little push pin. They'll tell, like, mark where you came from, right? I don't know if you've ever seen this, and it's like typically a restaurant, like some touristy area, something like that. It seems like I've seen them at the beach in Gulf Shores or somewhere like that. And over time, as each customer comes in here, it becomes obvious what the pattern is that where most people come from, right? There'll be lots from the big cities and stuff like that, right? It's that same kind of thing. It's very low tech, right? Nowadays, people continue to test this theory, but they have things like GIS, if you know what that is, geographical information systems, and it's all done on computers, and it's really high tech and much more accurate too, right? And I don't know, for criminology, like this type of technology has really advanced in recent years, right? So, most large police departments have someone that maps crime, right? And they, let's take homicide, for example, right? I'm thinking about homicide because I'm teaching this other class on it, right? And this is often done with homicide, is they will map every homicide in a city. And typically, I mean, almost always, homicide is not evenly distributed across the city. It's just like everything that we just talked about, right? It tends to be in certain neighborhoods. And based upon that information, that's really useful information for cities, for police departments, for people who, nowadays, like in Birmingham, there's these like social workers that will go to places. There's been a homicide, and they'll go talk to the people that were there, perhaps the family that might be motivated to seek revenge because their family member or their fellow gang member was killed, and they'll do things to try to prevent them from engaging in like retaliatory violence, right? And in some cities, they'll like, look, we understand they're killing some of your guys, you're killing some of their guys. They ain't got you yet, but there's a good chance they're going to get you. And if you want to get out of here, we'll help you. In fact, we'll buy you a bus ticket out, and we'll get you set up in a place with free rent for a month or something like that. And that's a very effective way of preventing violence, right? It can cause problems for those other cities, and they're not always happy that some cities are sending those people, but it's been shown quite effective. And the other things, that's kind of a lot of police departments now do what they call hot spot policing, as they identify, and they can send more officers, and they can have people walk around, they have people drive around, stuff like that. And that's has proven to be a fairly effective way of reducing crime, or at least moving it to other neighborhoods. Some people argue it just moves it to other neighborhoods, but yeah. So that is, that's social disorganization. Yeah. I don't know, I think that's, for the most part, that's a pretty good, explanation of how it works. It's really those three things. Now it does, if you look at the, 12th slide, right? There have been researchers that have gone in those neighborhoods and done survey research, right? And they ask people, like, how much do you trust your neighbors, right? How much do you get along with your neighbors? And they ask, do you strongly agree that you can trust most of your neighbors? Do you strongly disagree? Those kind of Likert scales is what they call those. And what they found is in those neighborhoods with lots of poverty, lots of population turnover and ethnic, people generally don't trust each other. They don't get along. They often don't know each other. They don't belong to I don't know, these civic organizations is what they used to call them. Not many people belong to these things at all, but like elk lodges and Rotary clubs and stuff like that. They don't belong to those things. Community watches, and they're not involved in these kind of things. They do not put aside differences to work together, right? That's organizing, right? That's what it takes to socialize the young. That's what it takes to create a nice neighborhood, right? With a good school system, and safe neighborhoods and all sorts of stuff, right? They often have different values and norms. And, during those times in Chicago in the 1920s and 30s, of course they had different values and norms. They came from different countries, right? Of course, they had their own cultures, right? Nowadays, to some extent, the European Union kind of shares one culture, but back then, Germans and Italians and Swedes and stuff like that, those were vastly different cultures with different norms, with different values and stuff like that, right? And then the last thing that's talked about on the slide, residents are unlikely to interfere with delinquents. That is very important for controlling criminal behavior, right? Now, I've lived in nice neighborhoods, I've lived in not so nice neighborhoods, right? If I look out my window and I see one of the kids in my neighborhood committing acts of vandalism, right? I don't know, spray painting a stop sign or something like that. Well, if I look out there, I'm going to know who that kid is. I'm going to know who his parents are. And I'm probably going to pick up the phone and let them know. Now, I've lived in some other neighborhoods that were not, they were poor neighborhoods. This was when I was younger and didn't have any money, and, before I became a professor and stuff. And I lived in kind of, these kind of slums that sometimes exist on the margins of college campuses and stuff like that, and cheap places to live when I was a graduate student and stuff. And in those neighborhoods, often if I saw a kid vandalizing something, I didn't know who his parents were. And you know what? I might not call the police. I might, because in a lot of neighborhoods, man, you probably should mind your own business, right? And in a lot of neighborhoods, there's a strong belief in, you don't involve the police. You don't snitch, right? And everybody knows snitches get stitches, right? So you might decide, and if you did call the parents might tell you to mind your own damn business too. And they might come over and, give you a black eye, right? But that's, in nicer neighborhoods, the parents are like, oh, I appreciate you telling me that. I'll take care of it. Don't you worry, right? Yeah. Yeah, residents are just unlikely to interfere with delinquents. Yeah. So they just mind their own business. And that's not good for the control of crime, I grew up in a pretty nice neighborhood, and back then, I misbehaved some when I was growing up. I was not always, I wasn't a bad kid or anything, but I'd get in trouble, like a lot of kids. And my parents would know about it before I came home, right? Because everyone in my neighborhood knew me, and they knew my parents, and they knew if they got on the phone, they told my parents weren't going to say, are you sure that was my Chris that did that? They were going to believe the other parents, so they were not going to believe me, right? And they were going to punish me, right? And they would tell that person, thank you for letting me know. And if you see my kid doing that, I'll let you know. And so, that's what it takes, The saying, it takes a village, to raise a kid, right? There's a lot of truth to that, right? And when we withdraw, particularly from public places, we're like, oh, it's none of my business, and I'm not going to interfere with other people, and people can raise their kids however they want to, and stuff like that. That's condoning delinquent behavior, right? And if that happens, those delinquents are more likely to grow up to be adult criminals, right? Because, the policy implications of this, right? So see how we're kind of using those concepts that I talked about in Structure and Relevance of Theory and Criminological by Alvin Goldner. You remember those concepts? So these are the tacit implications, right? If crime is produced by qualities and characteristics of neighborhoods or communities and non-individuals, right? So social disorganization is caused by population, ethnic, and poverty. Then if you reduce the poverty, right, through generous welfare benefits, right? If you get people to talk to each other and know each other, right, that should reduce crime. If you get people to settle down and stop moving in and out, right? And there are ways of doing that, like subsidizing rent. If people are at risk of being evicted, they could get help with there so they don't get evicted. That's a driver of population turnover, right? And if you can affect those things, and the theory is true, then doing those things should reduce crime, right? And not only would they reduce crime, but they'll reduce all those other neighborhood social problems. Like they should reduce STDs, and they should reduce high school dropouts. They should reduce illiteracy rates and all that kind of stuff. They should reduce the number of divorces, right? Yeah. So, and this also tells you, like, if you want to reduce it, you focus on the community, not on individuals, right? And if it's these characteristics of social disorganization in the community that cause crime, then you know what? Punishing individuals, that's kind of irrelevant. Probably won't have much effect, right? In fact, it could cause more crime, because when we incarcerate people, we pull them out of their neighborhoods and put them in prison. When they get out of prison, they move back. What is that? That's population turnover. That contributes to social disorganization. There's other things that we do, like when people engage in criminal behavior, increasingly we force them to pay fees and fines, and every time they have to meet with a probation officer, they have to pay fees, and If they're a drug offender and they have to pee in a cup, they got to pay for that. And if they go to prison, their family has to pay to talk to them on a phone. And well, all those things make people poor, make those neighborhoods poor. So those aren't going to help reduce crime if they're causing more poverty too, right? All right. Yeah, and also like one thing I want to point out, right? No matter what you feel, right? I don't know. I get sometimes I try to refrain from talking about politics, and this is not real political, but it is about a politician, right? We had a president that taught law at University of Chicago, right? And earlier in his career, before he was a law professor, before he was a senator, he was a community organizer, right? And the idea of a community organizer, that there are people that can be their job, and they can go into these neighborhoods and they can organize them in a way, right, that reduces all sorts of social problems. That comes directly from social disorganization theory. Now, you guys might not remember this because you're a lot younger than I am, but that job that Barack Obama had early in his career, a lot of people made fun of that. They were like, what the hell is a community organizer? And I'm a sociologist, like I know exactly what that is, right? And there's a long tradition of 100 years of people doing that in Chicago, and it's not a BS job. It's not it's a job that really changes people's lives, right? Now, and it has a long tradition in Chicago. Most people in the South have never heard of it, though, right? Well, they might have heard of it if they lived in a poor neighborhood that needed a community organizer, but a lot of more affluent white people of the Republican Party were like, what is a community organizer? It sounds like to them it sounds like a made-up job, but it's not a made-up job. It's a very serious job, right? One that has a long tradition in Chicago. It's helped a lot of people, right? And I always thought that was like, man, that's sociologists. So we gotta tell people that's not a made-up job. That's a real job, right? And they do a lot of good, and there's a lot of value in that job and stuff. And I've had students that have done that job that have become community organizers, and it's a very honorable job, right? But you know how things are when they get political. People often insult each other without knowing much about each other at all. So yeah, he worked within this theoretical framework, and there are other people, lots of sociologists that do this. You go into those neighborhoods, you try to organize people. You get them to try to meet in groups and communicate with each other and get to know each other and get to trust each other and figure out what their goals are and how they can achieve those goals, and go to their politicians and ask for funding and demand funding, or they won't vote for them again and stuff like that. And that's how you turn around. And, I think most of us would like to turn around our poorest neighborhoods, our neighborhoods marked by low social disorganization. That's a very valuable, worthwhile exercise. So, and some of y'all might want to do that type of work. And if you do, just, let me know. I'm happy to help you with that career goal and stuff. All right. The only other thing I want to say is a little bit about collective efficacy, right? The new updated version. Oh my goodness, I've talked 50 minutes. I better make this. In a lot of ways, collective efficacy is the opposite of social disorganization causes crime. The opposite of that is collective efficacy, right? it draws upon psychology. In psychology, there's something called self-efficacy, right? People vary in their level of self-efficacy, right? I'm gonna get to collective in a sec, right? So, and people vary within their own life, right? When I was young, like a lot of young people, I was often full of doubt, right? But by the time I got to my early 30s, I was like, um, I'm a fairly capable person, you know? Like if I'm given a task, right? And I was in graduate school at this point. It's like if I sign up for any class and I have enough time to study and read the book, and I'm smart enough that I can make an A in pretty much any class. That's and I also believe that, like, if I decided I didn't want to be a professor anymore, and I decided to enter into some other occupation, I have a high level of confidence I would succeed in it. I don't know if I'd be happy doing it, but I think I could, get a job and be successful and make money and get promotions and stuff like that. And you know, that's how I am now. That's not how I was in my early 20s. I was like full of doubt in my early 20s. But by the time I got 30, I was like, I'm a competent person. I can do things, right? That's that belief, that confidence in yourself. That's self-efficacy, right? Now, collective efficacy is slightly different because it's not about an individual, but it's about a community, right? And communities, just like individuals vary in self-efficacy, communities vary in collective efficacy, right? And early I said, I've lived in nice neighborhoods and I've lived in not nice neighborhoods, right? Bad neighborhoods. And I've lived in neighborhoods that have a lot of collective efficacy, and I've lived in other ones that did not, right? And, because I've been successful and I live in a much nicer neighborhood than at any point earlier in my life. And one of the things that I was kind of amazed about the neighborhood that I live in now, where people tend to stay here, there's no poverty in this neighborhood. I mean, none, right? People know each other. They trust each other. They're willing to intervene in the acts of juvenile delinquency by their neighbors' kids and stuff like that, all that stuff. But if people want something in this neighborhood, chances are they're gonna achieve it, right? Here's an example. This really surprised me. This is like the first thing. It's like, damn, I live in a very different neighborhood in my life, so I was kind of surprised about this, right? I live kind of close to Sanford, and Sanford had some property that was kind of abandoned. It had a building on it that was abandoned, and a lot of people kind of felt like it was an eyesore, and people in the neighborhood like, oh, you can get that torn down, and it's an eyesore, and maybe it's bringing down the property values of everyone and stuff, and it just doesn't look good, right? And so a bunch of people, I was not one of them, started organizing. They're like, we're going to get Sanford to tear down that old house, we're going to do something. And I'm kind of thinking, like, why would Sanford do anything? Like, we don't. But they went to their city councilman, they went to their mayor, right? And not only did they get them to tear down that old dilapidated building, but after they tore it down, they're like, what would be nice if there was a park there, and it had like a park for our kids to play in. It had like a playground, like swings and benches and picnic tables and stuff like that. And we want Sanford to turn that lot into that. And I'm thinking, man, I was kind of amazed y'all got them to tear down that old building. I don't think, well, they knew something I didn't know, right? And they started talking to people at Sanford and started talking to the mayor, and they started putting pressure on them. Like, look, you're our neighbor, and you hadn't always been the best neighbors, right? This would be, a gesture of goodwill if you did this, and it would improve relations between, the community and your neighbors and stuff like that. And those relationships haven't always been the best, right? Well, you know what they did? They rented that lot to the city for 10 years for $1. So they didn't give them the lot, but damn, they pretty much gave them the lot. I mean, the city rents that lot for $1, right? And they got some people to donate some playground equipment and stuff like that. And it is a park, right? And kids are playing on the swings. So I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe they did it, right? That's collective efficacy. My neighbors knew something that I didn't know. They knew who to contact. They knew who to exert influence on, who to persuade that this was the best thing for Sanford to do. They organized. They talked to other people and got them to call the mayor and the city councilman and talk to people that worked at Sanford, and they made it happen, right? And I was like, oh man, this neighborhood has high collective efficacy. And I've never, I was like, this ain't, because you try that in one of those neighborhoods where all the college students live. And, I don't know if any of you guys have ever tried to talk to the mayor about something, but like, they're like, you're a student? They don't, because you're a student, you're going to be gone probably before the next re-election. And as a general rule, they, like, I'll listen and be responsive to the needs of people that are going to stay around here, but for the most part, they just kind of ignore college students because they'll be gone in a short time. And that's similar to like poor neighborhoods too. It's like, you call your city councilman. Well, a lot of people won't know who they are, or the mayor. But if you do call them, they won't answer the phone. They won't call you back. They definitely won't try to, do things for you and stuff, right? But in this neighborhood, they do. I was like, man, that really impressed me. And that's my example of collective efficacy. And I've certainly lived in other neighborhoods that did not have that, And yeah, and that ability, like a park, is a social good. Like one person can't achieve that. Well, you know what else is a social good that one person can't? A school system, right? Safe streets, right? All the nice things about a neighborhood cannot really be obtained by one person. It takes a community getting together and organizing and investing and stuff like that, right? And so that's collective efficacy. You can kind of see how. We also have a little bit of talking here about incarceration, which I brought up earlier. And then one more thing, ecological fallacy, right? So when I talked about social disorganization, I said at the community level, poverty, ethnic heterogeneity, and population turn leads. That does not mean that the poorest people that move the most, right, of certain ethnicities, they're the ones that commit crime, right? And if you believe that it does mean that, then you've committed the ecological fallacy. A fallacy is like a faulty pattern in thinking and logic that can lead you to conclusions that are wrong, right? And so that's a mistake to commit the ecological fallacy. It doesn't necessarily mean that individuals, right, that are poor. It just means individuals in poor neighborhoods right? Or more. In the same way, it doesn't mean that the individuals that move around a lot, it's just individuals in neighborhoods that move around a lot, right? That's kind of, I don't know, that's kind of hard for a lot of people to grasp, but there will be a question about that, right? So just because areas with high poverty, ethnic diversity, and migration rates tend to have higher crimes does not necessarily mean that individuals who are poor, members of ethnic minority, are removed more often would be criminals, right? That's the ecological fallacy, right? I think that's it, right? Sorry, I went over an hour. And this is the second video, right? If you're still with me and watching the end of this, man, I feel like I need to apologize to you, right? Maybe next time you watch the video, we could even have a talk about whether y'all want me to do this or whether you want me to make these videos every week. I'm happy to do it, but it's just hard to say everything in a small amount of time. If you want them, but you just want me to be briefer, I can do that, right? I'll probably post a discussion board and get some feedback about these videos and their length and stuff. But yeah, that's it. I'll get this one posted soon, and make sure you take that quiz before Sunday at midnight. Have a nice night.